Happy Ascend Sunday morning, folks. Um, Good to be talking to you. Be better if I was talking with you. Um, but we'll get to do that next Sunday if you're able to make it. Before I get into announcements and um, and prayer requests, though, let me give you our text. Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. Okay, so next week we're going back in person. By then, I will have had my second vaccination shot. I know some of you have already gotten yours as well. However, we will still have to observe social distancing and masks. But yeah, uh, but at least we'll get to be in person. We'll get to sing some songs together and enjoy the presents. And yeah, it'll be good. So I know some of you can't make it. You already had family events going on. I get that. That's okay. Um, but you will know that after that, hey, we'll see you maybe the next Sunday. So um, very cool, very cool. That's coming up just next weekend, and there may be a chance my mom is there too. I don't know that for sure. I know she's coming up to get that second shot with me. I don't know if she's going to stay that long. Um, she has quite a bit going on down home, so she often can't stay very long. But anyway, maybe she'll get to be here with us too. Prayer request wise, for the most part, we have all of the previous requests still on queue. I don't know of any of those that have actually changed a whole lot. Um, Sister Carrie's still trying to sell the house, still has the situation in her shoulder. Sister Shaw is feeling better. Doctors still haven't figured out exactly what all's going on, but she is feeling better. And my back is better, but I still got a ways to go. And yeah, just frustrated, but oh well. I'm also feeling good enough. I can't do anything. I know not to do anything, as far as except stretches and exercise and stuff, but not to lift, not to work, any of that kind of stuff. Um, but I'm not in pain like I was, so I'm feeling better. So I could do more of at least this kind of work and creative work on paper and that sort of place. So that's progress. Leroy, still pray for him. He's supposed to have a procedure coming up soon with those legs. It's really severe, and his back has been off and on. Adam's back has been off and on and improving, but better. Sister Nikki did have a prayer request today. She's feeling a special burden for non-believers. So let's pray for people, first of all, in our town, our families, and then, branching out into the greater Aroostook community in Maine and so on. Keep praying for her and her kids. Um, can be a pretty lonely existence when you're working graveyard shifts at night and then coming home to sleep when everybody else is awake. Then also separation from her boys some. So pray for them. Pray for Sister Rianne's family and for her friend who's been dealing with that chronic situation. Been dealing with it a long time. I think he also had some back issues going on and some insomnia. Um, so yeah, pray for Sister Teresa to have a financial blessing. She's going to have some repairs done to the roof. In fact, I think I need to get someone in the church. I noticed that snow and ice has done something to one of the vent pipes on the church roof too. It's leaning in a weird way. So we got few little things around the property we need to get done. There's some siding that needs a little TLC. One of the gutters, ice and snow, has torn up gutters on the side of the church. So a few little jobs come up on the church too. Nothing super expensive, though. I do want to talk to you guys, and maybe we'll have a little business meeting about getting more of the parking lot done because it's really bad shape. We got the area around the front going around the corner there, and I'm thinking we can maybe do. We'll see how much it costs. It shouldn't be as much special work to do from there all the way back to the fence, but if we can't afford to do that much, maybe we'll do a section of that. But we'll talk to. I think it's Triple L paving we did the last time, and try to get that done this summer because it needs it. So we've got a few little projects coming up around the property, but we're okay financially. I think we're still sitting around $8,000 in the bank. So hey, not a bad. It's a good time to get some work done. Yeah. Pray for Sister Scott's family downstate. Pray for Jordan. He had some job interviews this week, and he seems to be more up than he had been. He actually wanted to go hang out and go to kids' birthday parties with the family and stuff down there. That's good because sometimes he can tend to shut himself away. Um, but he got him a new haircut and and was going out and doing things, and he's got several job interviews he's looking into, and some of them are very exciting opportunities. So who knows? um, but pray for all the family down there that everyone is okay and protected against sickness and illness, and also that they're provided for and everyone is safe and secure. Um, pray for Mark, Bob, and Sarah, and pray for today's lesson, and pray for our nation that we get better and better at learning how to actually talk to each other instead of talking about each other or shouting at each other, so that we can actually beat this virus, um, and get the economy back on track. There are some good numbers. Virus wise, pandemic wise, there's been some bad numbers lately because people have been just wanting to ignore the things that were working. And we will be able to have more freedom as long as we're smart. We just got to be smart. We got to get used to there's going to be slight tweaks to living conditions. Um, and it's good to be mindful of how infection happens, because chances are this won't be the last virus we have to battle. And it's one we're going to have to battle on an ongoing basis. But we have to remember we've had several scares over the past several years where we thought things could have gotten bad like this. And fortunately, we were able to beat back those, but every single one of those could have gone bad, just like the coronavirus has. So this is an ongoing battle. We get lulled into a false security and thinking that you know somehow those things just don't really happen. There's just something that happened in history or happens overseas, and well, that's just not historically accurate. History says that was a myth that we were living in, right? That notion that things really just never that bad. I mean, you don't even have to go that far back in American history to find pandemics. I mean, the flu in 1918, and we had the polio was tearing the nation up back in the middle of the 20th century. I mean, but we had a few decades there where things seemed to be, hey, rosy, and we bought into this false notion that, oh, it must be all good now. We got it all beat. And it's just not the case. Reality finally hit us again. So get used to it, get used to reality, and we can learn how to take this reality and make it something wonderful and make life a life here too. The only way to live life, it wasn't the old way. The old way used to be the new way before the other old way got phased out because it wasn't working anymore. If there's one constant in life, it's adaptation and change. And then the ones who don't adapt die. So get over it, get over the anger and the blame, which are never useful. They're only useful at maybe getting people angry at each other, recruiting people to your side. But that's kind of a dumb, short-sighted goal, right? Rather than that, making things better, improving, building, loving, expanding, those take real work and planning, and they're not reactionary, and they're not some short-sighted, finger pointing game where all that happens in finger pointing games is everyone gets their eyes poked and no one can see straight afterward, right? So yeah, so let's live smart, be smart, right? And be about making life better for those around us rather than trying to get mad because we think they're making our lives worse. Okay, let's read our text right now, and then we'll pray over the lesson and over the prayer requests. And remember, we're going to be in person next Easter Sunday. All right, Genesis 2:15 says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it." I like that verse. The Lord God took the man and put him in the garden. He put man here in the garden, and he put us here to work it and to keep it. Not to ignore it, not to abuse it and use it, not to turn it from a garden into something else that suits our purposes, but he put him in the garden to work it and keep it. I want to talk to you this morning from the title, Walking Through the Garden Alone. Walking through the garden alone. Lord, we love you today. We're so glad to be with you, and pretty soon we'll get to be with you and with each other in the same place. And that's going to be exciting, Lord. We ask you right now to, first of all, help our prayer requests. God, have someone buy that house of Sister Carrie. she's a hard worker. She's a wonderful, wonderful, loving person. She loves her family, and she's just been a wonderful member of this community for so long. God, we want to see her blessed. Bless her, Lord. It's, it makes our hearts happy when we see the people we love happy. So God, send her a blessing, send a buyer for that house. God also help repair the rifts in the family of Mark, Bob, and Sarah. We also ask you, God, to touch Sister Carrie's shoulder. She's been soldiering on with the pain and having a joint that's basically deteriorated to not even being there anymore. We just ask you, God, to send a miracle there. God, also put your hand on Sister Shaw. She's had some tough spells here in the last month and a half, 2 months now, and it scares all of us. And we just, God, keep her strong, make her strong, and either heal whatever it is or give the doctor some guidance so they can figure out how to compensate for it. Also, God, put your hand on Sister Nikki. You see the burden she has for people who are lost and hurting. God, let us all do what we can to reach them and to teach them to be sensitive to those who are in need around us and be an answer to their prayers. God, put your hand on Sister Nikki. Give her some sunlight and some respite, and let her find your peace and joy. God, even in a life and a pattern, a routine, a weekly routine that can be a little bit isolating. And God, let her have some wonderful times with her sons, Lord, and let them spend time together and let those relationships be strong. God, we ask you to put your hand on Sister Rhiannon and her family, keep them all safe, but also God, put your hand on her friend who's been battling chronic back condition as well as insomnia. We ask you to put your hand on Irene way down in Florida. God, let her feel your spirit, even though, God, she's been isolated in that nursing home. Let her feel your spirit close to her. Put your hand on Sister Elaine and bless her financially. Put your hand on Leroy, touch his leg, and let the varicose vein thing be taken care of so he can get on with living. We ask you to touch his back, let that continue to improve. Do the same for Adam and his back and my back. We ask you, Lord, to put your hand on Sister Teresa, send her a financial miracle so she can get that repaired under that house on the roof. God, we ask you, Lord, to put your hand on all those who work in the community. God, do a work there. God, protect them and let us keep beating this thing and getting better and better and figure out how to come back together as a community and support each other and love each other instead of feeling the tendency to accuse and blame. Do that for our whole nation, God. We need your work to be done. We need to be restored. Help not only us to beat back the disease, but the economy to recover and us to come together. Put your hand on the sermon today. In Jesus' name, bless it to our minds and hearts. And let me speak it fluidly. Amen. Okay, so walking through the garden alone. All right. So, I didn't realize when I talked on the phone with Sister Barbara this morning that I would touch on something that happened to coincide with the lesson, but I did. We talked about coming back next Sunday for in-person services to talk about if there's any prayer requests and ask how her mother-in-law was doing. Everyone seems to be doing fine there. And, with things thawing out and melting, regardless of snow this weekend, folks, that's going to be gone. In fact, I think we're supposed to get rain this evening. So by the morning, all this new stuff that fell, it's going to be gone, I think. And then we're supposed to get like 60 by Wednesday again. So it's going to be gone, which means spring is here, even though it may not look like it exactly right now. It's here, which gets me to thinking about, people getting out in the yards and doing gardens and stuff. And I don't know if you know it, but Sister Barbara is the gardening guru in our midst. And if you have any questions about planting or flowers or growing vegetables, it doesn't matter. Ask Sister Barbara. She is a wealth of information, and she's been doing it a long time. So I asked her about planting tomatoes, and is she going to plant me this year? And she says, well, actually, I don't tend to plant too much tomatoes. I'll just have a few, plants that I'll get. And I don't remember if she said that she does put them in pots and move them in and out, but I did ask her if she tries to start growing them early indoors and put them outside, and she says no, she doesn't bother with that. She just waits till May to put them out. And that's the thing. I don't, if I had a lot of time, I would do a big garden again, but I don't have the equipment to till up soil and do all that. And I would enjoy it, but also, sometimes we go down to see my mom and and grandmother, and sometimes we even travel out of state. So it's real hard to have a big garden when you're going to be away a lot. But I do like fresh tomatoes. I like having fresh tomatoes. That was the one thing I remember growing up when we had a garden as a kid. We had a big garden growing up. And the thing I mean, I enjoyed it all. The vegetables, I like fresh vegetables. Bam, the superstar, the superstar of the garden for me were all of those fresh tomatoes, fresh garden grown tomatoes. By the way, in North Louisiana, you can grow some really good tomatoes up here, but something about that really hot summertime, and maybe it's the kinds of things in the soil. Those tomatoes tend to have more flavor, a sharp, like a more brilliant taste. I found the tomatoes I grow up here, I can grow some really sweet ones, but man, they're very mild otherwise. And if you want a really good flavor with a high acidity, but also sweetness to go along with it, there's nothing like a good, you know, southern summer to make a good tomato. But I like those sweet tomatoes I can grow up here too, but it's hard to grow them. It's hard to grow them because it takes forever for our summertime to get enough heat for them to ripen. I can grow some beautiful plants. The garden I had back here, man, I had a jungle of tomato plants, but they were just, I barely had any ripe ones. And by the time it was time for frost, I was basically harvesting all these green tomatoes. So there's this challenge with this short season and how cool it remains in the summertime even. The workaround was what I mentioned to Sister Barbara about putting tomatoes in pots, or you can buy them, already partially grown from like Lowe's and I think Walmart too, and other nurseries. Bring them home. They work pretty good. I got a few tomatoes last year. I think I had four pots, with tomato plants, and I got a few out of that. And the way you can get around that, if you get them early, you can try to have them indoors and then move them out. But that thing requires more babysitting, the way Sister Barbara pointed out, because you can't depend on the sun and rain to do the work for you. And I remember they never seemed to flourish like those that I planted in the soil several years ago. Those took off. My goodness, they really were beautiful plants. Just the tomatoes didn't ripen. But those in the pots, they do okay, but they don't quite flourish that way as tomatoes that are planted in the ground or in beds. And I was like, isn't that interesting? The tomatoes that actually are planted are the tomatoes that really flourished. When they were really planted, when they were able to grow, they had no artificial walls limiting their roots from reaching out further and further. Those are the ones that really flourished and thrived. I I have been thinking also recently about where I grew up and the conditions in which I grew up. I grew up in a little bitty blue house, right off of a 2-lane highway. The highway, it was one of those places where two different routes come together. It was called, for our address, we called it Route 2. In fact, our address was Route 2, Box 139, Changaloo, Louisiana. But we didn't live in town. Not that Changaloo was much of a town. It was, but barely. We were in the middle of several towns, and none of them were hardly anything to speak of. Haynesville was the biggest, and it only had like 3 red lights. It was also called Highway 521, and it was out in the middle of nowhere. We lived in the middle of nowhere. Little blue house off of this, rough-edged 2-lane highway, set back against, pine forest behind us. And that hot Louisiana sun we beat down on the house in the yard in the summertime. And I remember watching this one lone oak tree we had up by the end of the driveway next to the highway, and it would just seem to dance in the heat waves. It was so hot. And the house itself seemed so empty. When, I guess occasionally we kids, me and Jonathan and Angela, we would fill it up with noise because kids, they can get rambunctious. But as often as not, if the weather was okay to be outside, we'd rather be outside than in and get away from each other. Because the house would seem so empty at times because mom and dad, they never figured out how to really talk with each other. And they seem to be living side by side for most of it. I mean, they'd cooperate and do church together and church functions together. And sometimes we would go out as a family to eat. We'd drive to another close town that's slightly bigger than Haynesville called Homer, and they had a Pizza Hut. One of the, I think the only major restaurant besides a couple of fast food places that any of the towns had. Um, but for the most part, they seemed to be, she was doing her thing and he would stay out working all day and all week and come home and have dinner, and then he'd go right back out the door, do something outside until it's time for bed and shower. It was almost as if growing up, where we were growing up, it was all just a prelude to moving somewhere else. We moved there whenever I was, I think, 11 or 12, and it never felt like home to us. Not to me. I mean, it was home because it's where mom and dad were, and it's where I knew everybody, but it never felt like home. And it was that way, it seemed that way for every one of us except for dad. It's like the home, the house, the place was supposed to be home was really just the place we were until we finally moved on to whatever life was supposed to be somewhere else. And that had to be a disappointment to my dad. See, we moved to Haynesville when I was 11 or 12. But for dad, it was moving back, because Haynesville was where he had grown up for the first 16 years of his life. I think he had a couple of years as a toddler in some small town in Arkansas, Northland, Arkansas. But for most of his childhood, it had been lived in Haynesville. And Haynesville had deep roots for my family. He wasn't just him. He, obviously him and his two sisters and brother, but right down the hill, the Scott farm, there's this big swath of property that Scott's owned. Right down the hill was where his dad's brother, my Uncle James, my dad's Uncle James, had lived, and he was raising his 6 kids. And so that whole hillside and out in the woods there on the other side of Haynesville from where we wound up moving when I was a kid, they were all over that hill playing together, and they had their own little community out there. And then when they come into Haynesville for church, and they knew everybody in town, and they had cousins and friends, and they would spend the night over, go hunting and fishing together, and go to the swimming hole together. And so when dad moved us back when I was, a preteen, for him, it was coming home. For us, it was going to a strange place. When he was 16, his dad had gotten a job as a postmaster of a small town right outside the Shreveport Bossier area. I say right outside, it's a little ways, but so they moved to a suburb of Shreveport Bossier. And Shreveport's a big city by itself. There's at the time there was 1 million people in Shreveport, and Bossier City probably had a good 400,000 or 500,000, and they were set right across the Red River from each other. And so it was a big place. And they moved there when my dad was 16. And he always felt, kind of like I did, I guess, about Haynesville. He felt that way about Bossier City and Shreveport. He felt like, home was back there where his cousins were. Home was back there where their own land was. Home was where they used to run through the woods and the hillsides together. And so for him, moving back to Haynesville was moving home. And when he got there, now he's a young man in his 20s. I would have been 12. No, he'd been in early 30s, I guess, when we moved back there. And he got involved. He invested himself in the church there, in the Haynesville church. At the time, Brother Hennigan was the pastor, and then Brother Holly came. We got invested in that church and began to, he picked up the bass, started playing the bass for the church. We sang in the choir and wound up having our own trio, my mom and dad, myself. And, I think the first Thursday night of every month, we would make peanut brittle and have fundraisers. And I learned how to sort out the bad peanuts, and learn how to butter the pie tins, and learn how to spin the pie tins to make that peanut brittle move out to the edges and have the same thickness. And then I learned how to when it cooled down, to rattle it out gently and then bag it up. The only thing I never learned how to do was how to be around the stove and cook and know when it was right to start pouring the peanuts in. But I learned how to make do everything else as far as peanut brittle. I remember doing that. And then we had youth night and the young people would get together. Dad got invested. He really got invested in the church there. He got invested in the friendships around town. He still had a lot of extended family around town, cousins he remember growing up with. His job, he began to have relationships at work there where he developed friendships and thrived. He was really vested in town there, and he he was starting to blossom. He was finally coming into his own, it felt like, to the point that he wound up developing a close friendship that became a business partner, and they opened up their own business in the oil field together there. And for a little while, they were making some really good money and building relationships. He was becoming a real part of that community. But meanwhile, back home, the rest of us never got grounded there. So out in the community, he was T, or he was WT, and everyone liked to see him come, and he had good relationships and friends. Back home, it was kind of a silent, restless place where he and mom didn't seem to know how to talk, and she seemed perpetually dissatisfied, and we just didn't seem to thrive there. And so I know it was a great disappointment for him, and it pulled at him. And so while he never seemed to get why the disconnection was happening with us, he never could fully bloom either, because home was kind of, well, that's the core of what defines a person. That's where you're from. That's what you point to. And yeah, 1 Corinthians 7:20 says, each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Think about that. Paul said each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Some translations use another word for that verb, remain, but let's look at the verb, this particular definition, remain. There's some value to that one as well. Remain talks about staying in one spot, right? Not moving around, but stopping and being there. That's important, because you can't bloom, you can't blossom if you never grow roots. There's a reason why the plants develop the way they do. The seed doesn't break open and immediately try to produce a flower. It doesn't break open and immediately try to grow fruit. When it breaks open, it sends a stem upward, and it sends something else, a tendril of roots, downward. And both of those things work together. The one up here is absorbing sunlight. The one down below is absorbing nutrients and water. And together they have to start establishing a structure that there's some give and take, back and forth. This one becoming a part of the community on the surface. This one becoming down below, becoming a part of that unseen community of connections and connectivity. And you can't do that unless you remain in that spot. Humans, we're not really made to be shiftless and restless and migratory and always trying to find some other place to blossom and bloom. We shouldn't just give up after a little while. Sometimes connections take time, roots take time. Building a network where you start collecting water and sun and nutrients takes time. You can't expect it to happen quickly, because if you do that, you are actually more just a predator or a parasite. If you just come quick, take things and move on. What are you doing if you're like that? Well, what you're doing is you're taking advantage of all the hard work of those who remain. And so you got to remain. If you're ever going to get to the place where you're truly blossoming and producing fruit, you got to remain. So there's some value in that particular definition of the Greek word. But another totally appropriate definition or interpretation of that same Greek word is not just to remain, but to abide. In other words, the verse could read this way: each one should abide in the condition in which he was called. Abiding is more than just remaining. Remaining is important. It's you got to remain before you can abide. Abiding is focused not only on being in one spot, but making that spot home, beautifying that spot, setting up house, absorbing things, but giving back too, flourishing or investing oneself where they have been called, in the state they've been planted, until not only do they remain there and become a part of the landscape, but they help improve and beautify that section of the landscape so that it becomes a part of the greater developing community. Abiding, abiding, abiding. Are you abiding where you are? Or do you feel like you're marking time? Is the only reason that you're remaining because you haven't figured out where else to go and what else to do? Or are you invested in that spot? Are you invested in those in your immediate vicinity, in those you're sharing the spot with, and those that are the neighbors? Are you abiding there? That's the only way it's going to get more beautiful. You know, beauty doesn't just happen. People think that, you know, they get into arguments that aren't really based in fact. You know, did all this happen by random, or was it designed or created? Well, there's another option. You know, maybe nothing happened by random. Even the things that we think happen random. Flowers don't happen by random. There's nothing really random. There's a lot of processes that are happening there. There's that process of the seed casing, that hard dried nugget, becoming softened over time by moisture. And moisture, you know, the outside casing of a seed is not impermeable. It's absorbing water by its natural chemical makeup. And then it's growing and it's flourishing over time. And all of that takes work. That's a slow process. Growth is a slow process. Becoming more beautiful is a slow process. Beauty doesn't just happen. It's made, it's willful, it's focused, it's created by people who not only stay in a spot, but abide in that spot, live in that spot, and invest in where they are. Acts 17:26 says, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods, allotted eras, times, and the boundaries of their dwelling place. Now, I want you to think about that verse. It's saying that God gives us a certain amount of time, but he also gives us a certain location. He established boundaries before we actually began to grow here. So there are natural boundaries, boundaries that happen as a natural permutation of communities of things beginning to develop and thrive. Think about that. When I think about the verse, I think about the natural communities of living things, of you know, herds of deer or antelope that naturally exist within the savanna of the Serengeti. You ever thought about how that moniker that people give lions, lion the king of the jungle? You ever think about how that makes absolutely no sense if you know anything about lions? Lions don't live in the jungle; they live in the savannah. Jungle, well, you can find leopards there. Leopards may venture out to the edge of the savannah, but yeah, they're more the jungle cat. Whereas the lion, he's a savannah cat. He's not a king of the jungle. He's a king of the savannah, maybe. Why? There are natural places. The lion is made to exist in that environment. He's made. He lives in a pride. He's designed to patrol that large swath in groups and lurk around watering holes. Right. The antelope are made to thrive in the savannah. Right. There are other animals that live in the jungle. There are these natural boundaries where these creatures seem to abide and live because that boundary is naturally home. And I think there are communities of people that live that way too. Sure, there are. Maybe we don't so much, but there are communities of people who do seem to live more naturally that way. I think if we were, since we're already talking about Africa, I think of the Maasai tribesmen of Africa, or I think of the Asian people who live in the Asian steppes. You know, the descendants of Genghis Khan, right? They they didn't establish communities by pulling out maps and drawing arbitrary lines and saying this is us and this is them. Let's go conquer them and absorb that. No, they didn't do it that way. The lines, or not the lines, but the boundaries that developed, they were natural boundaries determined by where the resources were, about where they could come together and find a place that would support a camp, where there was water. There are places where these natural boundaries that Paul said God gave us, and I'm sorry, not Paul, but where Luke wrote God gave us in Acts 17:26, that happened because that's where we belong. You think about those natural boundaries that exist and develop, they're permeable like the husk of the seed. They may look clear from a distance and hard and defined from a distance, but as you get closer, you realize they're more porous than that. They allow room for other people, for other creatures, for other things to move in and out. And there's not a lot of animosity and tension at the crossing of the boundary because it's designed to let others in and out. And then I think about those those really hard lines, how we Westerners tried to codify this hard sense of a very specific tight boundary by drawing lines on paper and calling it maps. I think about how we seem to be obsessed with turning those arbitrarily drawn lines into fences and walls, enforcing them with guns and bombs and laws. You know, I wonder, maybe we developed the ability to make these artificial boundaries so well, and we're so fixated with them and we take this such violation, if because we weren't so good at living in the natural boundaries that God put us in, the ones where communities happen, where people give and take and learn how to be neighbors. Let's face it, we so many of us in America over the last 100 years, being good at community and neighbors, it's not our forte. We're good at walling ourselves off behind fences and walls and digital space now, right? We become isolationists. It's every man for himself. And here's the problem with that. We're not designed really to live that way. And our mental health in this nation kind of proves that it's hurting us. Our rates of depression and suicide and other things seems to be climbing. Why? Because we're not really focused on thriving where we are. We're focused on keeping where we are or moving on to somewhere else. We're focused on hoarding, walling in, but that's not thriving. There's nothing to do with thriving. Thriving is about reaching out, about branching out, about root spreading out, about absorbing, not keeping things in, but absorbing and giving and becoming a part of the community. That's what thriving is. You don't thrive by walling yourself off. We're socially oriented creatures. No flower blooms shut away alone from the sun. No fruit grows isolated from other plants and pollinators. No tree, no tree spreads its limbs and gives back if it tries to turn its roots inward more and more and more, and instead of spreading out and interweaving with the roots of others. That's when it gets strong. That's when the wind can come and it'll stand. We got to thrive. Thrive means growing, and growing, true growing, doesn't mean. Think about what we've learned about the value of caring for the soil, and instead of claiming the soil for one crop like soybeans, or one crop like cotton, or one crop like some grain or potatoes, but we've learned, you know what? If this soil is going to thrive and keep giving back, we got to be giving back to the soil. We got to rotate these crops. We got to let fields lay fallow for certain years. We got to let natural things, processes, and living things do the work. Mixing together is actually beneficial. That's when thriving happens. Thriving is a communal thing. Thriving is a community thing. Thriving is a us thing, not a me thing. Like I said, no flower blooms shut away from the sun. No tree grows stronger by having its roots, wall itself off. The soil has to be enriched. We've got to give back if we're going to be given to. Genesis 2 verse 15 says, the Lord God took the man and put him in a garden to work it and keep it. All of those creatures, let's face it, that garden was not a little vegetable patch. That garden was this vibrant, ecologically rich place where all these different animals and trees and plants, that's God's idea of a garden. Not this neat little concise thing with little rows where we put fences up to keep out, the birds and keep out the rabbits but no, God's idea of garden is all these things are living and moving and working together and creating this space of interaction and living together. That's how they're thriving. That's how they're thriving. Let's thrive. Let's not be walking through our little gardens alone. No. Let's remember this whole world was supposed to be a garden where we all walked and enjoyed it together. And it's only been through the actions of man that it's become something else. That's not God's intention. That's not the way he made it. Let's be the ones who work to make it what he intended it to be. Make our lives with each other what he intended them to be. Go forth and multiply. Be fruitful and multiply, he said. Being fruitful happens through the interaction of living things, not being walled off by ourselves. I love you. Can't wait to see you next week. Be sure you take some time to shine a little ray of sunlight on someone else, and you'll find that it reflects back and makes your life brighter. See you soon. Bye.